Hi. My name is Eric Lindley. You can find me on GitHub at ericlindley-g. And I am a product manager on AMP. I've been on the AMP team for a little over 3 years now. And I'm here to talk about designing a component that people will actually use, the kind of process that goes into designing one of these. So it's easy, right? You just figure out what to do. You research how to do it, you design it, build it, launch it, and then iterate. And while it's sort of easy to talk about these things verbally, to just sort of say it, to go in this sequence, it's often easier said than done. And it's very tempting to skip steps along the way, even though you know that designing for the user and designing with research and with a strong grounding is actually what you need to do. So just to talk a little bit about that, what that process is what I'm here to do. So how do you decide what to build? You have to start out by figuring at a high level out what you need to do. And there's a lot that we could be doing. We have a lot of bugs in GitHub that we could go through one by one. At the time I took the snapshot, it was 1,345 open bugs. And sure, we could just do that. We could also invest more in technologies we're already invested in integrating better with. We could contribute tools that already exist in the ecosystem, whether they're tools that produce AMP documents or otherwise could integrate with them, and much, much more. The point is that there's far more impactful, important work that we could be doing than we possibly even have close to enough bandwidth for. So how do we actually choose what to do? And this is a little bit of a rehash of what Paul talked about earlier. He had a much more surreal and kind of horrific slide and delightful. But basically, you do want to listen to users. But you don't necessarily want to listen to the solutions. The solutions that people generate independently are often not as good as what you generate thinking about it from a more holistic level. But their pain points and their needs are super, super important to listen to. And so listen to the pain points first and the solutions second. This isn't to say that their solutions won't actually be good. Often it's the case they know exactly what they need. But important to think about it in a broader context. Also, it's really important to think about the impact of what you're doing in contrast to the effort. Folks are likely familiar with this already, but there's a fairly common matrix on like what you should be doing. It's fairly obvious after thinking about it a little bit that the things that you can do that have a huge amount of impact that are super low effort, you just do those. And you also want to invest in some really meaty things that will pay off later, in addition to some things that are maybe low effort, low impact, but get like a good cadence and satisfy a whole bunch of needs possibly quickly. And that you probably don't want to invest in things that take a whole lot of effort, but don't have a ton of impact. So how do we actually assess what that impact is? There are a ton of moving parts in AMP. There are many, many stakeholders. You could gauge impact in a whole bunch of ways. And one thing that we do is we look directly at developer feedback. We look at developer and business issues, including both isolated feature requests that come in, little sort of pieces of things that people need that are probably in that low impact, low effort category, in addition to the larger kind of coherent use cases, the things that they're trying to solve. This could include things like support an end-to-end product discovery and checkout flow, something that has the entire context of the goals that people want to achieve. Support dynamic and personalized content is another example of this. Maybe a slice that goes across a whole bunch of use cases but is broadly applicable to a lot of things on the web. Or potentially support a news consumption experience. These things that are higher level and a little more complex, and also maybe touch a little bit more on the full user journey instead of an isolated thing. So we also research pain points for users, not just developers and businesses, but as I think you've already seen today, a few different cases where we laid out what we prioritize, and it really is the user first. So we want to think about pain points on the web, how to provide a better user experience, even if business and developers aren't strictly aware of exactly what these things are. For instance, apps offer seamless transitions between states, the ease of not having to sign in over and over, other things that we have the opportunity to make way better in AMP, and that folks just focusing on implementing a single thing often might not be aware of. Although, of course, there's a lot of bleed over and a lot of developers are actually thinking about these things as well. And so I think the things we've mentioned are already in the repo because there are fairly sophisticated folks out there as well. All right. And we also want to think about not just how do we tackle these use cases and features individually and support things, but how do they pile up and sort of aggregate and what constitutes an actual vision for AMP as a whole? There are sort of philosophical approaches about what AMP should be that have real ramifications for the developers and users actually experiencing these things. So, for instance, how opinionated can and should components be with regard to the user experience in them? How should we approach situations where developers use AMP outside of the context of a valid page? How supported is this? How encouraged is this? There are like really interesting ways to slice it and things that have ramifications down the line that we really want to be thoughtful about. And what we end up with after assessing impact, estimating effort, looking at all the kind of constituencies in the AMP ecosystem, and gathering a mix of projects across these important areas is something of a roadmap of activities for a given quarter. This is a very specific slice. Of course, there's a huge ecosystem of folks who can and like should be contributing aside from that. And that's like one of the big reasons that we're here today, that this like can't and shouldn't be the only thing that's focused on. But at least today, this is where you find a lot of the major projects that are being pursued in AMP today on the AMP project website. All right, so once you've figured out what you're actually going to do, and you actually need to go about designing the feature, you need to tackle the features one by one. And this stage is pretty critical, of course, because even if you're building something at a high level that users care about, like a date picker, for instance, there are a lot of different ways to build it. There are a lot of examples in the wild for how you might approach something like this. And it's only by talking to users about their needs that you end up with something that actually works. Here's an example of a date picker that we launched and that people are using and giving feedback on now too, and I'll get to that a little bit later. The point right now is basically that we always research. For smaller features, this could be something as simple as reviewing feature requests and potentially asking some more questions of the folks requesting these types of things. For larger features, it might mean doing additional exploratory research to start out and then usability research later on. But it's just super important to refine these things in the context that they'll actually be used and not our imaginations of how they might be used. So what does this mean concretely for contributors? Well, when you're proposing a change that affects UX, one thing that's super important to do is to describe the use case for the feature in enough detail to get a coherent idea of it. Why does it exist? What sort of features are important to it? So a basic description helps a lot. This is especially true if there are a lot of references in the wild. You can say a date picker and that'll evoke like a more or less concrete image for people. But even better is breaking down some of the features that are sort of necessary or have even differing levels of necessity for a given launch. Here is our list of features, sort of an early snapshot of our thinking into what is maybe a P1 feature, what might be launch blocking, and then later on what might be P2, nice to have for some, possibly critical for others, but you also need to just sort of cut and launch at some point and then iterate later. If you do have an issue that affects UX, it's important to get feedback from a UX expert. And one way of doing that is to tag your issue as needs UX in GitHub. That will help get attention on it. It might not mean that someone will like sweep in right away, but it's a good flag that someone can go through GitHub and like look at all the needs UX issues. Have I seen this? Have I not? Also important, as I sort of mentioned earlier, you want a GIF or a GIF. It's really your choice, or a screenshot or a prototype of your issue, like examples that exist in the wild, maybe on your non-AMP site, maybe on someone else's site, maybe in jQuery or somewhere else, just to give folks an idea of what this thing is and how it works. And then as you work on it, or if you already have an idea of it, screenshot, prototype, something like that to show people in more detail what you have. And very importantly, you want to bring it to design review, to the friendly folks in design review, and get feedback, because a lot of folks have approached similar problems many times before, most likely, and have tips for efficient ways to do things that can save a lot of trouble early on. Let's see. Yeah, and it's good in design review. It's not certain that every time you'll have someone who focuses specifically in UX there. So it's useful to give people a heads up, like, hey, could a UX designer be there? So folks can give feedback in the right context. All right, so there are also some good principles to consider while you're going through and designing a feature as well. One critical, gone over this a lot, but to put users first. You also want to think about context and the full user journey and not just the feature you're developing. And it doesn't need to be this complicated. If you're just building a date picker, you don't need to think about like what the person had for breakfast that morning before they're interacting with. But often zooming out just a little bit and imagining an actual flow is helpful to intuit what the actual needs are. There's kind of an apocryphal story, and I'm sort of like full of turn of the century comparisons today, apparently, but there's an apocryphal story that the Sears Roebuck catalog was made just slightly smaller than the Montgomery Ward catalog, because when cleaning up, people would stack it on top because that's just very satisfying and it makes sense and it's more stable. And so that would be the first thing that people would reach for. And it's only in thinking about like the full journey, not just when someone has this in their hands, but the context for the usage, that you'd come across an insight like that. Yeah. So let's see. So yeah, consider the whole customer journey, or as much of it as relevant, and not just like the tiny, tiny feature that you might, or the, not tiny, tiny feature, but sort of chunk of the project that you might be working on. Also very important is to think about accessibility. And accessibility, a lot of people think like maybe the user is blind, and that's certainly one case of accessibility. But they might be colorblind. There are a lot of sensory but also cognitive differences between users, and accessibility encompasses a whole range of these things that are good to think about. And thinking about a screen reader in particular, a case where a user is sight impaired in some way. I don't know if you've ever done this, but if you go through a screen reader, a device that essentially reads out the user interface element by element as you navigate a page, if you can't visually navigate it as a user, it's often really, really terrible. It'll be something like button, 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 text, welcome to such and such page, button, button. And it's just impossible to use. And so it's one thing we do in AMP is make sure these accessibility affordances are possible for developers to put into practice, because we can't anticipate or like really translate all of the things that developers would need automatically. So we make it possible, but don't do it all by default. But we also do look for opportunities to get good defaults when we can. And that's something to think about as you're building a component as well. So let's see. Another thing to think about, as I kind of mentioned before, is how opinionated should your component be with respect to visual design? Is it completely flexible? Something like AMP Live List, which is a component for live blogs, it basically specifies divs, different elements of content that you fill completely. There's no opinionated visual design. As opposed to AMP Carousel or AMP Lightbox Gallery, which has very specific design. It's sort of thought of in such a way that you can just drop images into it and you'll get a lot of UI out of the box. And the reasons for going one way or another depend a lot on what you expect developers to do with your component, what work you want to save them versus what they'll want to customize. And that's another sort of interesting area to dig into and be thoughtful about as you go through and design things. Another thing, of course, is developer experience. What are the most useful things for developer experience? The degree of customization that you offer. Is it better just to expose all CSS classes, essentially make it so all of them can be altered? Or is it better to expose a lot of functionality through attributes to make it super easy potentially, but also maybe limit the amount of customization for different things based on the expected use case and the sort of trade-off between having a lot of options versus making it simple to understand and navigate the options available. And then finally, desktop and mobile support. One thing you want to do is start with the assumption that components should work responsibly at any sort of standard viewport size, which includes large desktop screens. Accelerated mobile pages, not a great name at this point, given the scope of support that AMP is really intended to have. So definitely do be thinking about all those things and keep those on your checklist as you're designing things. All right, so the experience for the feature is designed. And now you need to think about the technical design and the actual implementation. I'm not going to go too much in detail on this. There have been a lot of other talks today that go into a bit more detail. But I will say that during this time, again, it is important to get feedback from your peers. So when you get to a logical stage for feedback, be sure to share both with engineers and UX and folks that can give feedback to make it the best kind of possible feature it can be. And for big features, it may make sense to review at all of these stages when you have kind of a design doc, when you have a prototype, when you have sort of meaningful finished parts of a feature to review piecemeal. An MVP, something that's like truly launch ready in the end. For a smaller feature, maybe these stages are all in the course of a day. And it doesn't make sense to like get feedback at every single stage. There's a little bit of a judgment call there. But what tends to happen is that people err on the side of undersharing. And what folks should probably do to correct for that is err on the side for oversharing, getting feedback, mitigating the risk of going too far down a certain pathway when there are sort of simple solutions that might accomplish the same thing or opportunities that you could potentially capitalize on. All right, so yeah, you're done with the feature, you've designed it, you've implemented it, and then you launch. You're completely done, right? Well, not really. You actually want to land these features as well in addition to launching. When we launch a feature, first of all, developers don't know about it immediately. In the future, people will get updates automatically beamed to their brains because that'll be super convenient. But they don't necessarily know about them automatically now because we diligently update the associated GitHub issue and feature requests when we're done, of course. Anyone following those issues will know that the feature is out, but the majority of folks that could use a given feature aren't necessarily on GitHub. They don't necessarily have the bandwidth to follow and monitor GitHub that closely. So first you want to document your feature really well. So folks, both experienced developers and people trying out their first AMP page, there's a broad swath of people out there that will be using AMP and it'll be useful for them. Maybe even some of these folks, this is their first web page and they've heard that like, oh, AMP is component based. I'm going to get so much for free. Why don't I try this? They should be able to quickly know how to use the thing that you've built. So you also, in addition to creating Markdown with basic documentation, you also want to build an AMP by example so folks can get a hands-on understanding of exactly how this thing works. And then you also want to spread the word in other ways. Often we write a standalone blog post for significant features, and typically we at least include it in a kind of collection of updates that we send out a couple times a quarter. And sometimes we'll even reach out directly to folks we know are waiting for the feature. People who have commented in GitHub, people who have sort of come up to us in events and are saying like, I am really, really invested in this feature, so they can try it out and give feedback. Sometimes the best advocacy for a feature and the best way to like really spread the word about it is someone who's actually tried it out and had some success with it. So that's nice to share as well. And maybe even more importantly than getting, you know, a lot of people to use the feature, like sure, if it's great and we think it provides a better user experience, that's a big win. But typically we don't get a feature right out of the gate, like 100% right for all the use cases that people use it for. People have niche use cases that might not be addressed. Sometimes they combine things in ways where it's harder to test. For instance, if someone has something inside Shadow DOM on a fixed layer on iOS integrated with AMP bind and like AMP analytics in some sort of strange way, there aren't enough dimensions to capture like the corner of a corner case that can potentially kind of show up. So it's really, really great to hear from people who are using it in the world, react to their feedback. And there are often improvements that we can make to address bugs and feature requests that come up later on. So be really sure to allocate extra time in the first even few months after a launch, but certainly a couple weeks for the questions that come up and can be folded back into documentation, folded back into the examples so that your kind of support for a given feature can be done at scale rather than on a one-on-one basis. But the bottom line is really iteration. It's not enough just to launch. You want to launch, land, iterate, and like really maintain features. All right, so just sort of stepping back and bringing it all together. You want to plan, and when you plan for the highest impact and effort across the kind of constituencies that you're thinking of, or, you know, like you can also be laser focused on your use case, but bring it to the group to sort of figure out the best way to implement in the context of AMP. Research, design with the user and concrete use cases in mind and a larger sense of the user journey. Launch, but don't just launch. Educate, advocate, land, and then iterate at each stage, all the way from the early design phase, all the way to post-launch and like looking for a way to improve and make your feature better over time as well. All right, that's it. Thanks so much.